So how does human movement work, and maybe more importantly, why don't you move properly? Okay, to wrap our heads around this, we really just have to understand a couple basic things about how motion is produced. Okay, I'll level with ya, this can get a bit confusing, but I'll do my absolute best to try and keep it simple. And I'll use an example to hopefully make it more clear. Let's say we're trying to open a door. So we just look at the hinges, see the hinges on the door all sort of aligned vertically, and they rotate around that vertical line. Right, so that's its axis of rotation. Right, so if I want to open the door, how do I do it? Okay, so if I go up to a door, go to the handle, and try and lift vertically up, what's going to happen? Right, the door doesn't open, okay? Alternatively, if I go to the handle and I try and just pull to the side, so pull in towards the hinges, nothing's going to happen. What if I just go up to the hinges, say screw the handle, and just try and pull from the hinges? Right now, unless I rip the hinges off the wall, doors are going to move. Okay, we all know, you just grab the handle and you pull. Right, so embedded here are sort of some rules of torque and physics, basically. So the axis of rotation, which is running through those hinges, we can't ever have a force pierce that. Right, so when we try and pull across the door from the handle to the hinges, it pierces that axis. When we try and pull from the hinges, we pierce that axis. We can't generate any force. We're not far away enough. Alternatively, if we try and lift the door from the handle, we're now running parallel with the axis of rotation. Again, nothing's actually going to rotate. We need to get away from the axis of rotation and not pull in the exact same direction that it's running. So what actually happens when we open the door, we pull perpendicular to the axis of rotation. We've got some distance from the hinge so we can actually generate force. And this is exactly how the body works. So we can essentially figure out which muscle is going to actually move something by looking at the joint and how it's going to rotate, what its axis of rotation is, and then the direction of the fibers of the muscles that attach there. Right, so if you look at the hip, you got the head of the femur. If I wanted to rotate in a horizontal plane, i.e. if I wanted to sort of spin my feet out, what muscle is going to do that? Well, if you actually look at the different muscles in that area, you could sort of see what direction the fibers run in. So there's a muscle like the glute medius, and its fibers essentially run vertically. Right, so now it's the same example as the door. It's trying to pull up. Can't do it. Whereas the direction of the fibers of a muscle like the piriformis, which is an external rotator of the hip, just as a hint, allows us to essentially treat it like we're opening a door, like we actually understand how doors work. Okay, I know that's confusing, but that's the heart of how the body works. What's very interesting about that is if we look at that same example, say the glute medius, even though those fibers are running in that sort of vertical direction, so that if we're trying to spin out, they're not really contributing. If we change the joint angle, all of a sudden everything's changing. Right, so basically what this is saying is that if you change the joint angle, you can change the function of a muscle. So just saying that something like the glute medius has one function would be likely incorrect, when if we can change our hip into, say, something like flexion, we might produce a different result. Okay, so that's how the body works generally. Why don't you function correctly? Why don't I function correctly? So really interesting thing to note is that essentially the freest segment is always going to be the first thing to move. Right, so I first learned this learning about the lower back and why core stability was important. Right, so your spine's a flexible rod. It's pretty loose. It's pretty free. Without the guy wire system locking everything down. Right, like those guy wires are your abdominal muscles. Right, so I would try and do exercises and then find that I was in hyperextension. Why? My spine was loose and my core was loose. Right, so the fix for that was try and up core stability so that the most mobile part of my body was no longer my spine. Similar idea to other areas of the body. For example, let's say we're trying to get the arm overhead, but we're going out to the side. So this is an abduction movement. What do we know about that movement? Alright, so there should be like a general, nice, smooth moving of the scapula. The delt is going to contribute a fair bit, as well as some other muscles. What if we see like a not smooth move, right? Much like what happens with my scapulars, maybe what happens with yours. It looks kind of janky, doesn't look right. Something doesn't sit right. Okay, well, one thing that might be happening, yep, the delts are firing, they're trying to abduct the shoulder. Maybe the serratus isn't firing properly. Why this is important is that the scapula might be the most free part of that movement. Right, so what we really want to happen when we're abducting is that the humerus, the arm, moves first. Once it reaches its limitations, so if it pushed any further, it would impinge, it would jam against the bone. Then the scapula starts to move. Right, so it's sort of like a two-step process. If the scapula is now the most mobile thing, not the humerus, we're not going to see that, which means we're going to see the scapula move early, and we're going to get some janky form of motion. Right, so if maybe the serratus wasn't firing properly, now maybe the scapula is more mobile. And now we've got a problem. Now how do we fix that? I am trying my best to figure out, I don't know yet. But that's likely why you're not functioning correctly. Something is too tight elsewhere, so now relatively speaking, this area is looser, or something is too weak somewhere and now this area is loose. Okay, and I do just want to really quickly wrap back to how our body functions, because this is a piece of information I've been looking for, and it's so cool. So for a few videos now, I've talked about bending through the spine. It's a real contradictory, contentious issue. And there was this thing I touched on recently, which is that apparently when you forward fold at about 90% of the movement, your back muscles turn off. Terrifying, because it's meant to break your back, but for a lot of people their backs don't break, and there's meant to be a passive tension. What I recently learned sort of just confirmed this. So basically what happens as we lengthen a muscle, even passively, is there's like a slack that starts getting taken up. Once we've taken it up, as we keep stretching, we increase the tension. Right? We know that if you've ever stretched a rubber band or a rope, that's just how life works. Right? Now, if we push to our end range, now, why does the back turn off in the first place? Don't know. But what we can understand is that we're really increasing the passive tension the further that we go. Now, what's scary here is that if you push too far, you get to rupture. But the point stands, this is how we're getting some extra sort of stabilization aspect when we are bending the spine. Now, this is a type of eccentric movement. So we're lengthening a muscle. And what's happening when we activate eccentrically is we're basically overcoming an isometric force, which is enough squeeze that we stay still. Right? We're overcoming that, so we're going to have a very slow lowering or slow extension of our muscle. But if we add more weight, that's going to happen more quickly. Which, if anybody else has ever tried to do eccentrics for rehab, you might have been really frustrated because you're using light weights because you're trying to rehab. But I think this indicates that maybe you need some higher weight for eccentrics because that's actually going to help you lower and beat that isometric force. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've been learning all of this and more as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I read 50 pages of a physio/exercise book and do 50 minutes of exercise in a day in attempts to rehab myself. This is day 40, and we're reading Newman's Kinesiology, which is where all of this info is from. Looking at the exercise portion of things. Now, I had a lot of success on the internal rotation front of things. For those who aren't aware, basically one of my hips, and often both, can't internally rotate. Like, it's ridiculous and it causes my hips to get impinged all the time. It makes it really hard to walk. I did a bunch of things for this. So the first thing I think is important is I tried to tell ChatGPT everything that I was doing, everything that was occurring because of it. It's kind of sycophantic, so I don't know how effective it is, but it recommended some things that were quite good. So for starters, I did a 90-90 isometric. This was hard, but okay. And then did this thing where I was standing, I flex my knee and I try and internally rotate. Again, barely any range, very hard, but it felt okay. And then we get to a really good point, which is I'm laying down on my stomach and I get one leg up into flexion or abduction, but both. And then I try and internally rotate. Wow, this burned. This felt so good. I don't ever feel internal rotation. This was so cool. So I also had like more range afterwards. So yeah, sick. Really big fan of that. And this might get an issue. So I find that my range is worse in extension. That's where I impinge my hip. So I often want to try and fix internal rotation in extension. But because this worked in flexion, it might, or abduction at least, it might sort of promote an argument that yes, I want to get to the point where I can extend and internally rotate, but perhaps that can't be the starting point. Also, in terms of cueing this exercise, I felt it was way better when I tried to essentially push my hip into the ground. It made cueing it a bit easier. Also, just really quickly on the side planks, I've been doing the side plank clamshell, and I've just noticed that my hip hinge seems to be a bit better. I sort of push into my hips to try and kick my hips back. With my hand I'm doing this, or at least trying to prompt it that way, and I'm noticing that it feels like a cleaner hinge, so that's really cool. And yeah, that is about it for day 40. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.